In a certain kingdom, in a certain state, there was a king. And the king had many servants. Yes, not just ordinary servants, but various craftsmen, carpenters, potters, and tailors. The king liked to have his dress made better than others, and his dishes painted more cunningly, and his palace decorated with carvings. The masters in the royal palace were apparently invisible. They all gathered in the morning at the royal entrance and waited to see who the Tsar would appoint for. And now it happened that a goldsmith and a carpenter clashed at the royal threshold. They clashed and argued about which of them knows their craft better and whose work is more difficult. Goldsmith then says, "Your skill is not great, you sit over a tree, you cut wooden things. Whether it's my job, I make everything out of pure gold, it's very expensive to look at." And the carpenter answers, "It is not a clever thing to make an expensive thing if gold itself is in the price. You hear from a simple tree makes such a thing that not everyone around you will be amazed." That they argued, almost came to a fight, but at this time the king enters. When he heard this conversation, he grinned and ordered, "You will make me both a curiosity, one of gold, the other of wood. I'll look at them and decide which of you is the best master." You can't argue with the king if life is precious. The masters went out of the palace, each to his own room, both thinking hard how to beat each other in skill. The king gave them a week's time. A week later, both masters come to the palace, stand in a row with the others, and wait for the royal exit. And each of them has a bundle in his hands. The king came out and said, well done." He ordered the queen and her young son, the prince, to be summoned to the chamber. "Let them look at you." The Tsar and the Tsarina sat down on the bench, and the Tsarevich stood next to them. The goldsmith stepped forward. "Order a large vat of water to be brought, Father Tsar." A large vat was brought. The master untied his bundle, took out a golden duck, and let it float on the water. The duck swam as if it were alive. It turned its head, quacked, and cleaned its feathers with its nose. The king opened his mouth in surprise, and the queen screams, "It's a live duck, not a gold one. He must have covered a live duck with gold." The master was offended. "How is it alive?" He took the duck out of the vat, first unscrewed its wings, then its head, and then took it all to pieces. "Spread it out on the table, and let's make it up again." I screwed it up, put it on the water, and the duck swam better than before. All the courtiers clapped their hands. "What a master! What a miracle I did! Never seen such a thing before." The king turned to the carpenter. "Now you show your art." Bowed to the carpenter. The window was opened. The carpenter unfolded his bundle and took out a wooden eagle. Yes, this eagle was so well made that it could not be distinguished from a living one. And the carpenter says, "The golden duck only swims on the water, but my eagle rises." And the carpenter sat on the eagle and turned the screw. The eagle raised it and instantly flew through the air from the royal chamber. They all rushed to the windows, looking, mouths agape, and the carpenter over the royal court in the air makes different circles. If the screw turns to the left, the eagle flies down. If it turns to the right, it rises. The Tsar's crown has slid down on the back of his head in surprise, and everyone seemed to freeze. No one has ever seen such skill. The carpenter circled through the air and flew back into the ward. He put the eagle aside. "Well, Tsar father, are you satisfied with my art?" "I can't find the words, I'm so pleased," the king replies. "How did you manage that? But how did you get him this screw?" The carpenter began to explain to the king, and at this time the queen how gasps, how screams, "Where are you going?" "Where to?" "A cat." Everyone turned at her voice and saw. While the king was questioning the carpenter, the young prince jumped on the eagle, turned the screw, and flew out of the window into the courtyard. "Come back quickly." "Where are you going?" And the prince waved his hand and flew over the silver fence with which the palace was fenced. He turned the screw to the right, the eagle rose behind the clouds and disappeared from sight. The queen lies unconscious, and the king is angry with the carpenter. "This," he says, "is a trick you deliberately devised to ruin our only son. Hey, guards! Grab him and throw him in the dungeon." And if the prince does, the carpenter's guards seized him and threw him into a dark dungeon. and the prince on the wooden eagle is flying further and further away. Pleasure Prince. Spacious, free around. The wind is whistling in my ears, my curls are flying, the clouds are passing under my feet, and the prince himself is in the evening, he flew to an unknown kingdom, landed on the edge of the city. He sees there is a small hut. The prince knocked on the door. An old "Let me go, Grandma, to spend the night. I'm a stranger here, I don't know anyone, there's no one to stay with." "Why not, son?" "Entrance, and there is a lot of space. I live alone." The prince unwrapped the eagle, tied it in a bundle, and entered the old woman's hut. The old woman began to feed him dinner, and the prince asked questions. What a city, and who lives in it, and what curia? That's what the old lady says. "We have, son, one miracle in the state. There is a royal palace in the middle of the city, and a high tower near the palace. The tower is locked with 30 locks, and its gates are guarded by 30 guards. No one is allowed in that tower. And the king's daughter lives there. As soon as she was born, she and her nurse were. The king and queen are afraid that the princess will fall in love with someone and will have to marry her to someone else's side. And they are sorry to part with it, it is the only one they have. So the girl lives in the tower, and what? And is the princess really good?" "What is it?" asks the prince. "I don't know, son, I haven't seen it myself, but people said it was the most beautiful thing in the whole world." The prince wanted to get into the forbidden tower. He went to bed, and he still thinks about how he would see the prince. The next day, as soon as it was dark, he sat down on his wooden eagle, soared into the clouds, and flew to the tower from the side, where the window in the tower was. Flew up and knocks on the glass. The princess was surprised. Sees. "Well done, beauty indescribable. Who are you, good fellow?" he's asking. "Open the window. I'll tell you all about it." The girl opened the window, and a wooden eagle flew into the room. They sit there, looking at each other. They can't get enough of it. The prince asks if she agrees to become his wife. "I agree," says the princess, "but I'm afraid my father and mother won't let me go." And the evil nurse who guarded the princess tracked everything down. She ran to the palace and reported that so, they say, and so, someone flew to the princess, and now this fellow is hiding. The guards came running, grabbed the prince, and dragged him to the palace. And there the king sits on the throne, gets angry, knocks with a club on the floor. "How dare you, so-and-so, robber, violate my royal ban? I'll have you executed tomorrow." They took the prince to a dungeon, threw him alone, and locked him up with strong locks. The next morning, all the people were driven to the square. It was announced that the daring young man who had entered the princess. So the executioner came, and the gallows was set up, and the king and queen themselves came to see the execution. They took the prince to the square. And he turned to the king and said, "Your Majesty, allow me to make one last request." The king frowned, "And you can't refuse." "Well, tell me." "Tell the messenger to run to the old lady's house where I lived and bring my parcel." The king and the Tsarevich at this time was already led to the gallows, put on a ladder. The messenger handed him a package. The prince unfolded it, mounted the wooden eagle, and was gone. He soared over the gallows, over the king, over the whole crowd. And the prince sent the eagle to the tower, flew to the familiar window, picked up the princess, and put her on the eagle in front of him. "Well," he says, "now you and I are." And the eagle flew them to the state of the prince. And there the poor carpenter sits in the dungeon, his eyes fixed on the sky. Is not the prince flying back? Tomorrow the fortnight ends, and the carpenter must hang by the rope if the king's son does not return. And suddenly he sees a wooden eagle flying across the sky, and on it a prince, but not an eagle descended in the middle of the royal court. The prince took off his bride and took her to her father and mother. He told them where he'd been for 2 weeks. They forgave him for their joy, and the carpenter was released. The king made a great feast. The wedding was celebrated for 3 months.